Let me start with what you're saying about customer demand. You've said this morning that customer demand remains incredibly strong. That hasn't necessarily been the story for the whole sector and at every price point, because some people may be put off by cost of living challenges, by war on the continent of Europe disrupting things. So give us a sense of just how strong things are at Volvo Cars.
Yeah, I mean, underlying demand is incredibly strong for across the range, actually globally, in fact. And perhaps most exciting for us is the demand for our electric vehicles, including the plug-in hybrids, is incredibly strong. And remember, we've actually raised pricing as well to cope with some of the price increases that we've seen, and of course that increasing rate of inflation. So despite those price increases that we put to the market, we've still saw underlying demand remain incredibly strong, which is obviously encouraging for the company.
Good morning, Jim. You just mentioned there about your pricing power. You've been able to pass on the price to your customers. Is inflation going to change your production plans in terms of changing maybe your focus towards higher end models?
Well, really, if you look, there's two or three things came in at the same time. So we saw the increase, obviously, inflation, underlying inflation itself, but we saw some of the events in the world, obviously the terrible events in the Ukraine has caused increase of raw material pricing, and we saw increased energy prices and, of course, freight and logistics costs. So all of those pricing have came at the same time, and that's why we've put that into the prices of the market. So for us, the move towards electrification remains a core strategy for us, and we are delighted that we can produce more electric vehicles and that the demand for those remain incredibly strong.
What's your latest guidance on the supply chain issues that the sector has been dealing with since the pandemic, Jim? And how is it evolving? Is it different to the early days of the pandemic from what your colleagues are telling you, the types of things you're short of, the things you're having to wait for? How is that supply chain issue evolving?
Yeah, so you saw the underlying supply chain issues across not just the auto industry, but in general in terms of semiconductors, and that's been well reported. By and large, Volvo we'll see ourselves come through the end of those constraints by the end of the second quarter, which positions as well from a semiconductor standpoint for a really strong second half to the year in terms of production. The headwinds, or the new headwinds that's came up, are obviously the pandemic effect in China. We've seen now Shanghai's been locked down for coming up on almost 50 days now, and the longer that goes on, the more turbulence that brings into the supply chain. Again, not just Volvo's supply chain, but the whole auto industry, and indeed the electronics industry in general is generally somewhat dependent on flow of raw materials and finished goods from China. So that is a concern for us, and we're keeping a beady eye, if you like, on the events in the pandemic in China.
Jim, you talked about how strong the demand is for the electric vehicles. I presume you're expecting to still beat that target of more than 10% by sales volume is electric vehicles by the end of 2022. And are you still sticking to the previous management's target of being fully electric vehicles by the end of the decade?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, if we just take that 10% number to start with, we will be solid double-digit numbers by the end of the year. And in fact, again, given the supply constraints, had we had the raw materials, then we would have saw that increase even higher than that. On the full electrification by 2030, that is the colours that we have nailed to our mast, and absolutely that is the speed and direction that the company's headed. So yeah, another full commitment towards that.
Jim, do you sense that in any of the markets, concerns around inflation and cost of living are going to weigh on demand, or is this market just so tight because it's difficult to perhaps get hold of all the parts you need all the time that actually there's no difficulty on that front?
Yeah, we haven't saw underlying consumer sentiment change, given even in China where we saw the pandemic have its effect, and of course that's affected sales in so much as that people are not out shopping, if you will, but the underlying sentiment of demand for certainly for Volvo cars has not changed, despite all of the turbulence that we saw in terms of increasing inflation, on underlying inflation, as well as increasing fuel costs for even domestic customers.
tying together those kind of two themes of like the supply chain issues of recent years and your aggressive transition to fully electric vehicles, how worried are you about battery capacity and also sourcing the precious metals involved or the key metals involved? And do you need to make any change in plans around battery capacity?
Yeah, so that strategy that we set out to 2030, one of the reasons that we wanted to underpin our own battery supply was because I agree, I think that battery supply may become a constraint, or may become a constrained component in the future as more and more people move towards battery electric vehicles. That's why we made the investment with Northvolt, and that joint venture that will allow us to basically be our own battery supplier here, right in Torslanda in Sweden. And we can expand that as well. That will also allow us to deep dive into the technology that surrounds the whole of electrical propulsion, not just batteries, but also the electrical motors and inverters and so on, power electronics, and the whole battery management system, which for us is a key component of the building blocks towards the future.